Hi guys, and welcome to another special lockdown interview here on SAFC Fan TV. I'm joined by BBC Radio Newcastle Sunderland commentator Nick Barnes. Nick, how you doing?
Not bad in the circumstances. I can't complain. It would be churlish to do so.
How are you finding life during lockdown right now?
Very strange. I mean, normally from this week onwards, I would be taking my annual leave, but it feels like I've been on annual leave for the last 10 weeks, although I've been, keeping abreast of developments. I've been doing, bits and bobs towards Radio Newcastle, Look North. But it's very strange when there's nothing happening and you're just waiting for something to happen. And, you keep on looking every weekend at where you would have been on that specific Saturday. I mean, even today, having a discussion could well have been at Wembley today, in a playoff final again. So it's very odd. And now we're waiting for the clarity on what's going to happen with the season next week, because I'm assuming we're going to get that on Wednesday or Thursday. And then we'll know whether we've drawn a line under this season or whether the line's going to be drawn later in the summer. So it is odd. It's a very, it is an unprecedented situation. None of us have been in this situation before. Yeah. There's been lots of debate about it, and there's been lots of talk about what or where we can go and what we can do, and nobody as yet has really come up with any answers, because we've not seen anybody put anything into action, bar the Premier League now starting non-contact training, and the Bundesliga actually getting back to playing football, and Spain now saying they're going to be playing from mid-June. So all a bit weird. I think the bottom line though is that, while all this is going on, I think everybody's main concern is that anybody we know, friends, family, you just hope they're okay, and that ultimately that's what this is all about. And as much as we're all missing the football and we desperately want it to come back, I think most of us, all of us, are very much aware of the wider context of why this is happening and where we are at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. That's like the main priority right now. I'd imagine being a football commentator, especially during the season, you appreciate the time off you get. But right now, surely you must be missing picking up the microphone and putting the headphones on.
Yeah, definitely. It's just frustrating. I don't relish sitting at home doing very little in real terms. I mean, I'm envious of people who are going into work at Radio Newcastle or wherever. I mean, I want to be going to a match on a Saturday. I want to be, doing my notes through the week. I want to be doing the interviews. I love that routine. I love that. That's why I love my job. I want to be doing it, and it is exasperating not being able to do that. And it will be just as exasperating, if not more so, for the players, and I think even more so for the fans, because it's something that I think we all realise how much we miss, or how much we rely on football. At a weekend. I mean, how much we rely on that ritual, if you like, of the football on a Saturday, the build up to it from the last game, and then looking forward to the next game. And as you get closer to the weekend, looking forward to that, our rituals. We all have our rituals on a match day. I'm no different to a fan in the sense that I have a ritual as a commentator as to, what I do when I get up on a Saturday morning, the clothes that I put on, the time I leave home, time I reach the stadium, and so on. I mean, and as fans, we all have that ritual as well. What time we leave home, where we meet our friends, when we get to the game and the game itself. And I think we're realizing in this lockdown just how significant those rituals are and how important they are to us in our daily lives, if you like. I mean, I know there's been a lot this week about mental health because it's Mental Awareness Week and everything, but I think this sort of lockdown has focused people's attention very much on our mental well-being, and part of our mental well-being is to be involved in routines, to be involved in something we do on a regular basis. And I think the strange thing is, in the lockdown, we've all adopted new routines, and I think a lot of people are going to struggle coming out of lockdown, because over this sort of 2-3 month period, we're adopting different routines and different schedules and approaching things a lot differently.
Yeah, and you touched upon there, people suffer with mental health. coming out of lockdown, it'll be like a massive struggle to them to like adapt to a new way of life once again, compared to the one that they were used to, which was the life being in lockdown, like keeping up social distancing. I mean, like going back into, if football's given the green light to start properly again in this country, where fans are allowed back into stadiums, it's going to be hard to like take everything in, like being a fan, just like all coming back to normal again.
Well, yeah, back to normal in inverted commas, because it looks almost certainly when football comes back, they're not going to allow fans in the grounds. I was reading earlier that I think Spain's going to allow a maximum of 197 fans into a game. Well, I mean, that's farcical, really. But, we're not going to get to normal until, well, at the earliest, late autumn, probably the new year. We're going to have to conceivably look forward to a new season starting behind closed doors with matches streamed, and that presents all sorts of problems for the football clubs, I suspect, in terms of what do they do in regards of season cards. Can you sell season cards if you're not actually allowed in the stadium? And our whole perception of football is going to be different. I'll possibly be in the stadium commentating as a broadcaster still, but watching a professional game of football, a league game with no crowd, with no atmosphere, and that, as every game goes by, will become the new normal. And I'm sure, we'll get used to doing that. But what is the impact on the football itself? I mean, I've heard talk about the Bundesliga and the fact the games are, almost like reserve games. They're not played with the intensity,
absolutely,
that a normal league game will be played at. And I think that's a fear then for the sort of integrity of the league next season. When we look back on it at some point in the future, there'll be a caveat to it. There'll always be a caveat as to, was it a real season? And that will obviously lead to a lot of debate and a lot of discussion, but it's unavoidable. I mean, it's very difficult to see a way around that in the current circumstances.
I mean, talk to me about the industry you're in, being a commentator. I mean, have you heard news from the BBC, like in terms of if you're allowed into the stadium to commentate on games, in terms of your safety being assured at the moment, or is that still all up in the air right now?
Well, it's all up in the air. I mean, apart from obviously the BBC lays down guidelines for its staff, and there are very rigid guidelines have been passed down now about our working environment. We're not allowed, I would say we're not allowed, they're keeping numbers in the office to a minimum. Distancing within the office is very much within the 2 metre rule, and desks are cordoned off, areas of the building are cordoned off. And clearly, if there was to be a resumption of football, and if we are to go as broadcasters and broadcast from games, and it seems, I think, fairly clear that will probably happen, because in Germany the press have been allowed into games, the media have been allowed into games, then the BBC, I think, it'll be paramount within their own guidelines that we would have to be tested, and our health and safety will be first and foremost before allowing us back in to do that. But I think the football clubs themselves are very mindful of that. They're mindful of that with their staff, with the players, and the impact this is all going to have. I think they are hurdles, but they're not insurmountable. I think certainly, given the amount of time people have to plan for these things, and the undoubted probably a month and a half before any football can be played, there's a lot of time to get those mechanisms in place. So I'm sure, in one sense, while they seem to be problems at the moment, they're not insurmountable problems, and I think they're problems that will be overcome. I
mean, staying with the players at the moment, I mean, it looks like they're going to be returning to training in this country very soon. As we're recording this interview, was it a Bournemouth player that's been tested positive for the corona?
A couple of Hull players as well.
And Sean Dyche's assistant at Burnley, Ian Wome, as well. I mean, how much pressure is particularly likes of the Premier League and the FA under now to make sure these measures are put in place for the players going back to training, and also if games are allowed to restart as well?
Well, I think there's huge pressure on the Premier League because of the league that it is. But I don't think the Premier League is, let's not, back away from the fact they've got so much money. They are so cash rich, if you like, the Premier League. I don't think they'll find any of those particular issues a major problem. That, I think, arises lower down the league ladder when you look at League One and League Two and what they decide to do this week. I don't think it's such a big problem for the Championship either. But the clubs are going to be mindful of everything, but I think the Premier League is almost duty bound to get these games played. I think, as someone pointed out to me this week, it will be a major embarrassment to the Premier League, who are deemed to be the best league in the world, if they were unable to finish their season, especially now the Bundesliga is back playing and La Liga is about to start playing again. I think that is heaped more pressure on the Premier League to get playing and to get it right, and I think they will. I don't think the Premier League is going to struggle in that sense. We've been reading about guidelines they put in place and the number of people they're going to allow into stadiums for games and how they're going to stream and so on. I think they'll be very much across that. My biggest fear is what happens, as I said, lower down. If there is a decision reached to continue the season, how the Football League is going to fund, how the Football League is going to test, how the Football League is going to arrange for the 23 clubs in League One, for instance, to travel and how they accommodate players, staff, etc., for some of those longer journeys, like Southend, Peterborough coming up to the Stadium of Light, AFC Wimbledon. So there are wider questions, I think, for lower leagues rather than the Premier League.
I mean, where I stand on it is basically, if League One is basically ended now, although I think some of the fans and the players will be disappointed, I think at the same time you've got to appreciate that we're playing in a league that puts safety measures first. And I think if the Premier League was to restart again and all of a sudden we see a second spike come into place, I think Premier League will be under massive scrutiny. And I just feel like at the moment it's all to do with the financial reasons as well, pressure getting the game restarting, because we don't want to see especially clubs down lower league and in the pyramids potentially go bust even.
My instinct is the season's going to end this week. I think it probably will. But my sort of my heart is saying, I want to see the season finished. I want to see it played out. I don't want to see in the football yearbook next year an asterisk next to all the clubs in League One or the promoted clubs saying they were promoted on an average points total or whatever that they decide to do. I just feel it's undermined the sort of, we use that word integrity, but it's undermined the 38 games that have been played this season. The graft, the labour that's gone into all those games for nothing. And then to end the season, in a manner which isn't really very satisfying. I mean, you can understand where Sunderland are coming from in wanting to play the season out. I can understand Ipswich, Peterborough, other clubs being in that situation as well, because they still see there's a lifeline for them to get promotion this season. There's enough games left. They're within points of the playoffs and potentially second place. So there's completely understandable reasons for wanting to get these games played. And in Sunderland's case, either more so because of the situation they find themselves now in League One and not really wanting to face a third season in League One, albeit this season will just feel slightly odd. But as you were saying about, the potential for the EFL to make sure that every League One club, if the season goes on, it's got the financial wherewithal, the medical wherewithal, and so on. It's testing. It's a huge test for them, and I think while Sunderland made quite loud noises about everything's in place and we can do it, I'm still sort of to be convinced that it's logistically something that can happen and can happen seamlessly, because that's what it has to be. Because if it isn't, it's going to be an almighty mess because of the knock-on for next season.
I mean, the big question on everyone's lips is if the season was to be like ended completely, like how they're gonna resolve the promotion and relegation issue. Like, where do you stand on that? Do you, like, out of all the scenarios you've heard about so far?
Well, it's difficult, isn't it? Because whatever compromise is reached is going to be flawed. If you can't finish 44 games, you're going to find that you're going to have a flawed compromise. As to the fairest decision, I mean, it's not as clear cut as perhaps say in rugby union. Newcastle Falcons being promoted from the Championship back to the Premiership with Saracens, 140,000 points adrift at the bottom. That was it cost absolutely common sense decision that Newcastle get promoted. Do Coventry get promoted? Yes, probably do. They've run away with it. They've probably got a gap now. I don't think anybody deny Coventry's right to go up. But then, you've got to scramble for the remaining promotion places. And it would leave, I think, a lot of clubs feeling chastened if they weren't able in some way, shape or form, with 8 games left, to have a say in who goes up with Coventry City. Points per game on the basis of what's being played, well, it's probably the fairest as an average over the season. But then there's an argument that in 8 games, 24 points to play for, teams can show, and we've seen it in the past, form. Who's to say who's going to come out of the blocks the strongest when if the league starts again, and have an 8-win run, which would catapult you into second place. And if Sunderland would have that, I mean, automatically they're going to have beaten Rotherham, they're going to have beaten Peterborough, they're going to be in a position where they could very much go up in second place. So, whatever happens, it's going to leave, I think, a bad taste in mouths if the season is curtailed. And you asked me what is my preferred method if that is the case. I think, average points, and they will play the 4-team playoff, and I think that is manageable and conceivable, and will probably won't leave as bitter a taste in the mouth of the clubs involved, because at least they're getting a chance to play the season out in one shape or form.
I mean, in years to come, we'll look back on this season as being like completely crazy in football history. Like, even if Sunderland found themselves in a good promotion position before lockdown, if we were given promotion right now, if we were in that position in the table, will we look back on it and think, like, do we really deserve it? Like, have we done enough as a team?
That's the nub, isn't it? That's the nub. I mean, this is the one of the questions someone had posed is that what if Oxford, say, who are in the playoffs, vote to curtail the season, knowing that they're going to be playing in the playoffs? Well, would that leave a bad taste? I think it would, definitely. Because how can you vote to end the season because you've got a vested interest in knowing you're going to be in the playoffs, but then play on? So I think, that there's a lot of clubs going to have to look at themselves very closely when it comes to making that decision as to what they want to see at the end of the season, because it will leave a very bad taste in a lot of clubs' mouths if the 4 teams in the 4 playoff places decide to curtail the season but end up playing their matches in the playoffs. So that's something I think that the EFL's got to be guarded. They've got to guard against. And the whole issue, as you come back to this, how would you feel if you were promoted? Well, look, you
take it, yeah.
You take it, wouldn't you? That's the bottom line. You take it. But I think on that same basis, you'd always have this little niggle banging away in there saying, I've taken it and we're back in the Championship. But, ultimately, I feel slightly sort of uncomfortable with the way, as a football fan, and as we've always wanted promotion and relegation, you never want to see a franchised Premier League. You want to see the ladder working. You want to see the teams promoted fairly. I'd always feel that little hammer's banging away in there, and I'd always be a little bit uncomfortable about the way in which it was achieved.
I mean, it goes back to the time of I don't know if you remember in 1990 when Sunderland beat Swindon in the playoff final, and obviously Swindon were denied promotion by the FA. We went up instead, and we ended up going straight back down the following season, finishing second from bottom, which answers the question, like, we potentially as a squad back then weren't necessarily ready for the top flight, maybe. And like, obviously it proved by the results we had on the pitch that season. Could like fans potentially feeling that is sort of like the situation now, in a way?
Yeah, to an extent. I mean, I think it's a strange one because the playoffs, we could sort of get plunged into an argument about the sort of the merits of the playoff final. Certainly the Championship playoff final, this one-off game, which is worth, they say £100 million to the winning team. So, suddenly a league campaign, which is sort of, one of drudgery and hard work and graft and sweat, turns into a cup final. And the psychology of a cup final is completely different to the psychology of a league match and a league campaign. Is it still, we get into that area of, are the playoffs the best way to end, a season? It's worked, it gets the crowds in, and it's been going now for however many years. So we could argue all day long, I suppose, about whether going up in a manner this season which isn't football, whether it's right or wrong, and I think it would just be another thing we debate about over the coming years, because there'll always be a debate about the merits of certain teams going up. I mean, are there other controversial examples? I mean, you can go back to when West Ham were relegated and all the talk about the South Americans in the team and how it was handled.
The Carlos Tevez situation.
Carlos Tevez affair. We come back to this fact that this season is unprecedented. We've got no blueprint, we've got no template for this season. Everyone's floundering around a bit. I mean, I do look at when Man United elected to drop out of the FA Cup to play in the World Club Final as an example of how you've got to be very careful about some of the decisions you take, because I think the FA Cup, for one reason or another, and one of the reasons is television, obviously, for the way they've changed kickoff times and moved cup ties over a whole weekend. But that Man United withdrawal hurt the FA Cup, and I don't think it ever really recovered from it. And I think the authorities now are going to be very mindful of what decisions they take regarding this season could have long-term effects to their competitions, and I think that's what has got to be looked at very carefully by the Premier League and the Football League.
I mean, you touched on, was it the Manchester United FA Cup situation there? How did you feel about, was it Liverpool in the League Cup this season when they went to play over in, was it the Far East, and they played
a team? Again, ultimately, though, Liverpool fielded a team, and I think they believed that team was good enough to go through. I haven't got a real problem about them playing it, actually.
No.
I think if they played a team that palpably wasn't good enough and could have been knocked out, then yes, I think it becomes an issue. But I think Liverpool made a decision. I think they knew what they were doing very much without. There's arguments that they undermine the League Cup as a competition itself, but there's an argument that's been undermined over the last decade anyway by clubs. I mean,
we might not even see it next season by the how football's going.
So I actually haven't got a major issue about that situation, because ultimately the tie was played, and they didn't withdraw from the competition. It was it wasn't a competitive game in the end, but they played it, and I think that's the important thing. They played it, and I think with hindsight, with Man United in that situation in the world, perhaps that's what they should have done. Played a team just to make sure you still had all 92 clubs involved in the FA Cup, or the number that were left in the competition at that stage.
Yeah, I mean, where I stand on, like, particularly the Liverpool situation, I just felt some of the youngsters that played that night, when they were absolutely thumped at Aston Villa, I think they were just at times left hang out to dry. I think you'd expect, like, a team that's in a Premier League title challenge to have, like, so much squad depth, where you'd, like, keep a few first team players back at least to, like, help these youngsters out, and, like, you'd still have, like, the capabilities to send, like, a good enough squad over to the Far East to win that competition.
Yeah, I think the bottom line was, though, Liverpool's priority was not the League Cup this season.
No.
And that this is just going back to what I'm saying about clubs. The way they've treated the League Cup is very much as the sort of the minor competition, the third competition that they're not particularly wanting to be involved in, but at least they are still putting a team out and involved. What the long-term future of the League Cup is, well, we'll, I think, probably get a better idea of that next season with whatever impacts from this summer. It may well be the League Cup is a competition that ultimately disappears, but clearly the Premier League clubs have always wanted some sort of revamp of the competition to make it worth their while appearing in it and making it worth their while reaching the final. So it raises questions, but I think my biggest issue is when teams start withdrawing from competitions, and when you start sort of undermining the integrity of the actual competition, whether it be the league or the cup, by not entering, or by not so much the weakened teams argument, because you can argue. I mean, Sunderland played a team of youngsters in the Checkatrade Trophy, didn't they, when they went through to the next round? So there's always an argument for reasons for playing teams, I think. But my biggest worry is when the bigger clubs start saying, right, well, actually, we're not interested in the League Cup, so we're not going to play in the competition.
I mean, I remember a couple of years ago listening to an interview on Talk Sport with ex-Newcastle United man and Liverpool midfielder, was it also German international Didi Hamann, and he just thought, like, I think we're the only club in Europe that has 2 cup competitions, and I think that just adds, like, mounting pressure to, like, get the season done, but, like, on the scheduled time it's given. With that, it just adds so much confusion, because, like, we're the only country that does have these 2 competitions, and I think if we only had the one, it would just make it so much more simpler.
Well, it would, and I think the landscape's changing, and I wonder. My biggest worry about the FA Cup in this season just gone, or the season that's currently hanging in the air, was the moving of cup ties to midweek, 5 games played over 5 nights, the changes in the rules about when you're at the latter stages, the sort of no extra time or whatever the rules are. The FA Cup, to me, if you argue, for argument's sake, lose the League Cup, then they've got to address the FA Cup and the problems that have become inherent with that competition, and they've got to find a way of redressing the balance again and making the FA Cup special for every club, because clearly it's not. And for the bigger clubs, the FA Cup, they make all the noises that they still regard it as a blue ribbon competition, but they don't necessarily treat it as such. And I think that's responsibility upon the Premier League and the FA as well, that they've got to address I think the balance they've got at the moment between the broadcast games on TV and when they're played is wrong. It's gone. They've made a bit of a mess of that. I think we need to find a way of bringing it all back in again to a weekend, and not as spread out as it's become, because it's diluted it so much. No wonder people have lost interest in the competition. No wonder the clubs have lost interest in it. So they have to find a way, if they do go down that road of losing the League Cup, of reinstating the FA Cup as very much the blue ribboned competition alongside the Premier League.
Yeah, I think the BBC, since they took over from ITV with the coverage, I think it's about 5 years ago now, I think they were starting to, like, ease that back in, like, slowly, compared to, like, what it was when, like, ITV had the deal. I just feel like a lot of fans today, like, don't appreciate the work, like, surrounding the FA Cup, because, like, it's like it brings so much money to, especially to, like, the lower league clubs in the game, and, like, helping further development. And obviously, as we're recording this interview, yesterday would have been the final this year, and it's just like so surreal that this is obviously the first year in my lifetime that we're not doesn't look like we're going to have an FA Cup final. I mean, I think even if football is like allowed to restart again, that there'll be just so much pressure to get that done, which is really sad to see, because it is.
And the most basic, simple thing is bring the FA Cup back to 3:00 on a Saturday afternoon. You know what? This whole business about the FA Cup being played at 5:15 on the Saturday evening, undermines all the sort of history of the FA Cup and the traditions of the FA Cup. And I think it's been quite. Yeah, and I think it's been quite interesting that in the lockdown, the TV company's been replaying the FA Cup finals with all the build-up through Saturday morning to the 3:00 kickoff. And there's a generation, I'm of a generation that remember all that and loved it. And there was something really special about that. Yet, the stadium is different now, and that's changed the dynamic as well. Yeah. But, and another thing is get rid of the semi-finals being played at Wembley. Little things like that, which are simple to do. It cannot be difficult to move a game to 3:00 on a Saturday afternoon. It cannot be difficult, however many contracts have been signed, to make sure your semi-finals are played back as they always used to be at Old Trafford, at Hillsborough, Villa Park. Tottenham have got an amazing new stadium now. What is so difficult about, and that in itself would be, a carrot to dangle to football clubs, especially lower league clubs, if they make it as far as the semi-finals. They want to play at Wembley, but most lower league clubs have got that opportunity now through the Football League trophy, if that exists still in the next couple of years. The cachet of playing at Wembley has perhaps been diminished somewhat, but you're sort of milking it down even more by playing your semi-finals there and then playing the final there afterwards and then playing the final at 5:15 on a Saturday night. I think they've got to look at it. Someone's got to sit down and look at it very closely as to what is the magic of the FA Cup. And how has that magic been lost? And how do you get that magic back again?
I mean, when I first started watching the competition, I remember the semi-finals were always played at one of probably the two very iconic grounds in the country that staged so many brilliant moments over the years, Villa Park and Old Trafford. And I think obviously now with Wembley being the home to the FA now, I think there's just like too much added pressure to get the semi-finals played at Wembley. But I think it's all to do with the financial situation.
It is money, and this is where I think everyone's been brought to sharp focus over the lockdown about how much money there is and how much money the Premier League's got and how little the EFL's got, and where that money needs to be appropriately invested and how you take the game forward. Game is going to change now as a result of lockdown. It's going to change because our habits watching football are going to change. There's definitely going to be a shift, and I think it's time for people to sit back and take a look at, with all the time they've got available at the moment, as what is wrong fundamentally with the way the game has gone, what is good about the way the game has gone, but how do we recapture, the good elements? How do we expand the good elements? How do you get the FA Cup back to a prominence that used to have? How do you get, the Premier League back to a prominence that allows clubs like Brighton, Burnley, whoever, to believe that one day they could win the Premier League like Leicester did? There are all these sort of questions which are fundamentally, trying to bring football back to, the system that it was when Accrington Stanley could conceivably believe they could reach Division 1. Now that dream is, unless someone comes in with many, many millions of pounds from Saudi Arabia, is unlikely to happen. But it could have happened back in the day because the way the Football League was set up and the way it was funded and the wages that were paid. I mean, all this talk about salary caps now and wage caps and so on. I mean, I think it's high time that's come in. The Rugby League has tried it. Rugby League has reinvented itself because Rugby League took a long look at itself, and Rugby League was brave enough to address the issues they had, even to the extent of changing the season so they play in the summer. Now, what is preventing football being as brave as Rugby League were in just taking a look at the game and addressing the issues that are within it?
Yeah, absolutely. Nick, we're going to move on to the current situation at Sunderland Football Club now. During the lockdown, we've seen an appointment of a new CEO in Jim Rodwell. How do you feel about that appointment? It looks like he's been brought in to handle a lot of situations that Stuart Donald would have faced, like if he was still in the role that he was doing. It looks like obviously Stuart Donald is still purely focused on trying to sell the football club at the moment.
I think it was a good decision. I think it's something that the club's been crying out for the last 18 months, 2 years. Someone who's at the club on a daily basis, a figurehead who will, brief the media when he needs to, is there to take a burden of pressure off the manager, is there on the ground, when he can see on a daily basis how the club is working at the academy at Black Cat's House, at the Stadium of Light. I've spoken to Jim. He's very approachable. He's stridently, got the best interests of the club at heart from the conversation I've had with him, and obviously what he said publicly about wanting to continue the season, understands how important, the football is to the fans here and how important it is for Sunderland to get back as soon as possible into the Championship. And I think, Jack Ross, when he was manager, always, one of his pleas to Stuart Donald, which always seemed to fall on deaf ears, was to appoint a chief executive, appoint someone that, could take the pressure off him. I mean, an example he would cite is that he would come off the training ground at midday and suddenly be confronted by a group of 25 businessmen who needed a tour around the Academy of Light, and 3 hours later he's accommodated that, he's given them the tour, and then he has to go back to the planning for the match on Saturday. Now that's the sort of role, that's the sort of job now that Jim Rodwell can inherit and take on. It's just basic management structure, and for all the good or the bad, whatever your opinion of Martin Bain, one thing he was very good at was every few months he would sit down with the local media and we would have a briefing, we would have a long conversation, we'd be with him an hour, 2 hours, and have a very good insight as to what was happening at that time. When the accounts came out, we were shown the accounts, we were talked through them by Angela, the financial director. And so I think to have that figurehead now back at the club, or a person in that position, is important, and I think it's long overdue.
I mean, I heard an interview with Jim Rodwell on the radio recently. He does sound like very calm and like collective in like terms of questions that were put forward towards him. I mean, I think that's just what like the football club like needs at this moment in time, and I feel like some fans have like overreacted like a little bit in terms of like the manner he was brought in. But I think we are in a better situation compared to like a lot of football clubs. So I think like we should be like a lot more appreciative of like things that are going on right now.
Well, I think the situation of him has brought everything into sharp focus, isn't it? And none more so than how clubs are going to deal with the new season and the financial aspects of that. And I think I think Jim Rodwell, I mean, there was a criticism about his CV and his background. I mean, but he's worked with the EFL board. He's worked on the board at Notts County. He's been 5 years at Scunthorpe. I mean, if there's any club that is, got very little income streams and struggle to survive, it's Scunthorpe. But he managed to sort of oversee that with varying degrees of success. And when people say about the ambition of Sunderland, why have you brought in a chief executive whose track record is all fairly much lower league, and as a player he was lower league, and aside from him being on the EFL board, well, Sunderland are a lower league club at the moment. Let's address the problems as the club where they are at the moment. We can address the bigger problems when we get there. Jim Rodwell might well move on if Sunderland reach the Championship. He might feel it's time for him to to move on from the club. We don't know, but I think he's been appointed to a club with the record that he's got, to a club that are in League One, and to all intents and purposes will probably be in League One again next season.
I mean, if Stuart Donald is successful in selling the football club, like it looks like at this moment in time, Phil Parkinson's job is safe, but you think that will be the first job the potential new owners would do, would like address the managerial situation?
Well, I mean, if you take the evidence of the Stuart Donald takeover and Ellis Short and Chris Coleman, you could argue yes. But I think we've got to be a bit more sanguine about the situation at the moment. I think Phil Parkinson, yes, look, there will still be detractors, there'll still be critics, but I think the job he did ultimately this season up till now has been a good job in the circumstances. You know, he had that awful spell when it looked like it was going to be very difficult for him to keep hold of his job, but Sunderland came out of that period and were one of the form teams in League One. Now, given that we're going to have difficult trading position in the sum in terms of players in and out, one hopes that, you know, they can, you know, adjust properly to that scenario, because there's, you know, the big question marks over players who are out of contract and who they can afford to sign next season if they're, you know, if we are going to be in this sort of behind closed doors scenario. But I think that Phil Parkinson's, he's got to be given the opportunity. He was, you know, his remit when he came on board was to get promotion this season. Now, he, above all else, wants to see the season finished, I think, on the very basis that he wants to fulfill that commitment. When the season's curtailed, I think he's got to be given that opportunity next season. And I think whoever comes in, when I say whoever comes in, I don't think we're going to see new owners at Sunderland for a while yet, because my gut feeling is that if you were looking to buy a football club, why would you look to buy a football club now when potentially you might have to put in a lot of your own money next season to keep it afloat?
Yeah.
So I think the selling of the club is a little way off. I think we're not going to see it sold this year. And I don't think we'll really see any movement on that until we've got a much more stable environment in football terms, and that's people back in the stadiums, income streams back up and running, and football clubs becoming potentially, you know, of interest to investors. But at the moment, you know, I'm not a businessman, but I know enough. I wouldn't want to come in and buy a club and start pumping in more money just to keep it afloat.
I mean, the perks we have with Phil Parkinson, you take the job he did at Bolton Wanderers, where there was a lot of financial problems going on at the club at the time, and he still managed to achieve results in terms of like bringing players in that he's had connections with, like down in the lower leagues, and like they still got the results on the pitch and like made the fans satisfied despite like the problems that they had up in the boardroom at the Reebok Stadium.
He's very well versed in those situations. I mean, there are some
Macron Stadium, as it's called now, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there are some question marks possibly over his management. I mean, it would be churlish of me not to say that there are a couple of issues that I sort of raised an eyebrow at. I think one of them was, you know, he was very conservative in the way he set up the team eventually with the, you know, the sort of three at the back, and we never really saw any change to that. And my gut feeling is, right, okay, you do it because you don't think you've got the personnel to adjust to change in the system all the time. But one thing that did become apparent was that other teams soon caught on to how Sunderland were playing.
Absolutely.
And that was part of the reason it led to the sort of hitting the buffers when they hit the buffers with the system. But, you know, that's, you know, part of that is down to personnel and the players he had available. And, you know, now he's got, or had Gooch coming back and so on, you know, perhaps he'd have seen through that period and got back onto a sort of even keel again. You know, there will always be a question mark over Aidan McGeady and how that was handled, and you know, certain little things like that. But overall, I don't think, as a manager, I mean, I don't think Phil Parkinson can really, you know, I don't think he can be accused of not knowing what he's doing or not being right for the club, because I think, as you pointed out, the experience he had at Bolton, his previous experience at Colchester and at Bradford, have largely been, albeit in trying circumstances, probably all those clubs, certainly Bolton, you know, his achievements have been quite commendable. And, you know, and I think he'd be feeling slightly, he would be, I think, very bitter if he found he was to lose his job in the summer on the back of the coronavirus, because, you know, he was moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and
he's moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I still stand by, like, he's a good manager to have in that league. Like, with the situation we're in, and like because of the uncertainty with like the ownership situation, I think he is like at times like steadying the ship. But like Sunderland fans at times like do add the pressure of like, we need to get out of this league, considering like how big the club is. But we have seen over the years big clubs like being in this league, like likes of Leeds United, Blackburn Rovers, Wolves, and they've adapted to the situation that their clubs have been in financially, and eventually they did get out of the league. And with Phil Parkinson, obviously you touched on, obviously at Doncaster away, that's when we first saw him play that 3-4-3 winning system, which I still think is probably the best away performance we've seen this season in terms of like our attacking play, the way we moved the ball up the pitch, how we broke with pace. And I feel with January just around the corner, with the new players he brought in, I just felt like it might have been a mistake in terms of like keeping that system, because teams were like starting to like tactically figure us out a little bit. And I thought with the new players he was to bring in, the likes of Lafferty and Josh Scowen from QPR, the system might have changed a bit to like ease those players in. Like was it Semenyo as well, the young lad who came in from Bristol City? But he kept it the same, and like we were starting to like tweak off a bit in the last 4 results before lockdown. But yeah, I still feel like he has the ability to change things around, Phil Parkinson. So, like, my view on it at the moment, like, we should still stick with him.
I think he's thorough when it comes to preparation. The homework that goes into every game is, it's second to none. I don't think. I mean, to a certain extent, Jack Ross was exactly the same. And I think there was an argument, if Jack Ross was still in charge, the points per game average could well have been enough to see them promoted this season, if that's how they're going to end the season, ironically. But I think you can't really go back to that now. The decision's made. Phil Parkinson's in charge, and as I say, I think his preparation, his sort of diligence when it comes to preparing the team is second to none. And I think all the more reason I can see why, on aside from the fact Sunderland want to end the season because they want to win promotion, I think there is the professional pride of the likes of Phil Parkinson who want to see the job out. They've got a determination and a real self-belief that they're the right people for the job, and they will moving in the right direction. I think the problems that were apparent at Bristol Rovers and that little spell were clear. I think that there was a point at which the players are starting to look a bit tired, and maybe, as you say, they were a bit conservative in the way they were setting up. But I don't think they were problems that Phil Parkinson wasn't aware of, even if he wouldn't necessarily publicly say so. So I can see why he is champing at the bit as well to see these 8 games played.
Yeah, I still feel like he has a lot more to prove as Sunderland manager, but I think the big issue in football at the moment is definitely like contracts with certain players who like could be going on a free in the summer. And I think the important thing that we need at our club at this moment in time is the manager working, like having a good solid relationship with the board, having the right communication to like get these contracts sorted out. Because I feel with obviously we've seen in Sunderland Till I Die, like with Jack Ross and Stuart Donald having like different ideas on like players being brought in. Obviously Jack Ross would try his best to adapt to that, but in the end it didn't quite work out. So I feel like that's a thing that needs to change. And obviously like 2 key players who looks like will be out of contract in the summer is goalkeeper John McLaughlin and fans' favourite in the middle of the park, and also plays at right back as well, Luke O'Nien. So yeah, I feel like those 2 players like we need are so important to like have in League One at the moment.
I think Luke O'Nien's got another year on if needs be. I don't think Luke O'Nien's contract is so as cut off as that. I think he will still be here. John McLaughlin, look, historically, every club he's been at has let his contract run down and then move to another club. He'll get a signing on fee, and I would be under no illusions that that's what's going to happen with John McLaughlin again this summer. Let this contract run out. Obviously he's been linked with Blackburn Rovers. He's 32. Will this be his last contract? He's not probably going to get the money he'd hoped to get at Sunderland because of the straitened circumstances now. But a Championship club probably got a little bit more money. I would be at all surprised if he moves to Blackburn and signs a 2 or 3 year contract there, and that would be his sort of last payday, if you like, as a professional footballer. And you can't blame him for that. I mean, that's football. That's the way it works. It's a difficult one. I mean, I think all clubs are going to have to start looking at what they're going to do with that sort of player structure next season. I've heard of talks of various clubs in League 2 and even Rochdale in League 1 are sort of looking at writing off next season already in terms of wages and not giving contracts which they can't afford to pay because they haven't got an income stream, and trying to make the most of their development squads, their under 23s or reserve players or whatever the situation might be, in a bid just to field a team with no illusions of grandeur when it comes to promotion. And in League Two we'd hope not to drop out the Football League, but certainly clubs are looking at a way of streamlining, if you like, their squads in the cheapest possible way. And I don't think Sunderland will be any different to all the other teams. The one thing I would say about Sunderland is I think that if that is the case with other clubs in League One having to cut their cloth, accordingly, Sunderland could benefit from that in being a bigger club and perhaps having a little bit more in terms of resources, in terms of the players they might be able to bring in and the players they will be able to keep this summer. And it could put them actually in a stronger position if they are, and let's assume that we are in League One next season, to actually, make a real bid to go up automatically.
I mean, was it the perks from that also is we just hope as fans that the 2 series on Netflix of Sunderland Till I Die will generate a lot of interest in the club in terms of the fan base, and just how if an owner could come in and get it right, the stadium can be rocking, so it does have potential. Nick, we've touched on players there. Obviously, I've touched on John McLaughlin and Luke O'Nien. From what we've seen this season, because it's looking very, very likely now that League One could be declared null and void, who would be your standout performers this season from what we've seen on the pitch?
Good question. I mean, I've been asked it a couple of times. Ultimately, I don't think anybody's been standout. I think they've all been flawed in one way or another, either through inconsistency or whatever. But I think you mentioned one player there, and I think if I had to sort of give a name, I would probably give it to Luke O'Nien. I think it's more almost for his boundless enthusiasm, for his never say die attitude, and I think the Netflix documentary showed as well how much he's matured over the time that he's been here. And I think taking it in the round with all those things in consideration, I would probably say Luke O'Nien. Linda Gooch has had his moments. John McLaughlin's been fairly steady, but didn't have the greatest of starts. You can start to single out players and say, all right, okay, I can point to that, and I can point to this. They never quite found the consistency. If I was to go down through the team, nobody really, even Luke O'Nien doesn't necessarily leap out as someone who has been brilliant every week. But I do think he's been, you cannot fault his determination to try and achieve something. And I think that's been the standout for me.
And I think this leads on to my player of the season. I think as the season has gone on, one man who's had potential bumps on the way. Obviously, we don't know the full detail, but obviously since Phil Parkinson's come in, he's gradually got better and better, and that's forward Chris Maguire also can play on the wing as well. And I just feel at times this season, he might not necessarily have had the best performance on the pitch, but he can change the game completely with a flip of a coin.
He can. My concern about Chris Maguire is it always happens with him that he has a really good spell, then he dips, and that's been constant through his career really, which is why he's never risen above the levels that he's risen to, because that's something Phil Parkinson nailed early and spoke to Chris Maguire about and addressed. But you still find a spell, and Chris Maguire's form had dipped when we reached those games before the season was stopped. I mean, I think the other player I would mention behind Luke O'Nien and has impressed me has been Jordan Willis, and that's another I think would certainly be in there or thereabouts. But Luke just edges it for me. But it would probably be a close run thing between him and Jordan.
I mean, I think Jordan's been a top player this season, especially his role in the back three. With Luke O'Nien in front of him, if a player overlaps Luke, he's sprinting over to that far side to help him out as well. And he has great defensive qualities. He's solid on the ball. He passes it very well. And I just feel he was definitely our best summer signing last year. That's worked out the best way.
I think
And
you're right.
but going forward, I think he'd make like a solid championship player, I reckon, in future. I think like my fear is the better he gets, like he's going to be one that we'll struggle to keep hold of. But hopefully,
the problem is, the better he gets, the better Sunderland get. And you'd hope that that if that's the case, then Sunderland are on the up again.
Yeah.
Sunderland, he's with Sunderland in the Championship. I think sometimes have to think, right, let's not keep thinking that our players are going to be leaving and moving to other clubs. Players come here because it's Sunderland, and I think that's why Jordan Willis is here, because it's Sunderland. And I think if they do get it together and they start moving up again, they get back in the Championship, it will be a club that players want to come to again, and that's got to be a positive. If I had to rule for one other player, just because it's who it is, it's Ali Mozturk as well. He'd be there in my vote, just because he's Ali. And he's almost the sort of new Naran Nosworthy. He's sort of a player that I think embraces the professionalism that he does as a footballer, but at the same time is a really nice bloke, absolutely fantastic to talk to. And for all the bumps and sort of the knocks he's had in his Sunderland career, he always bounces back. And I take my hat off to him for the way he's sort of ridden those troughs in his Sunderland career.
Yeah, he had a tough start, didn't he, Ali Mozturk? I remember when he came in. I think he struggled to adapt to the English game straight away, but I think Jack Ross certainly helped him out in time to struggle, and I think he gradually got better as the season went along. And I feel like this season as well, when he did play, I think at times it was a little bit unfortunate when wasn't he dropped down at Tranmere away? Yeah,
for make way for Bradley, and which was tough. It was really tough on Ali, but I mean, I think he took it on the chin. He wasn't happy, and I spoke to him that night, and he clearly wasn't happy. But he bounced back, and Alim does that. He will not. He doesn't. He's not one to sulk. He wouldn't. He's always, I think, a big believer in his own ability, and he always felt that yes, it was harsh. It was hard on him to get dropped that night, but he always, the back of his mind, felt there'd be an opportunity for him, which, as it turned out, there was. The irony being, of course, he was back for the one player that had come in for him after the injury at Portsmouth. But he's a fighter, and I think he's a good person to have in your dressing room. What his future holds, I don't know, because obviously he's one of the players that's out of contract in the summer.
Nick, we're coming to the latter stages of this interview now. Obviously, we touched on a few times Sunderland Till I Die. What did you make of the second series? Do you think the whole club was portrayed in a good way, or do you feel like compared to the first series, it was a little bit of a disappointment? I mean, from what I've seen, like the reviews on it are pretty mixed, but especially I think you came across very well, especially like your notebook in the office, like preparing match notes before a game on a Saturday. I mean, a lot of fans just can't get enough of those. How you fit them all onto the page.
I'm amazed myself sometimes. My eyesight's not what it used to be. It was a different series, a different sort of series. The two directors were totally different in the way they handled the project, if you like. Suits, who did the first series, had a much more laissez-faire attitude, if you like, to the structure of the series. He also had 2 more episodes to play with than Richard had for the second series. I think Richard's was a tighter, much more structured documentary in terms of the 6 episodes and the themes that each episode were trying to handle. And they went for specifics rather than that sort of emotional. There was an emotional feel about the first series, the fans, the manager, the dynamics within Series 1 were never going to be replicated in Series 2, because Jack Ross is a completely different manager to Chris Coleman. There was never going to be anything like the same access to players that was afforded to Fulwell 73 in the first series, and neither of them got dressing room access, but it was always going to be limited. And I think, and I think the overall, some of the issues that were apparent in the first series, like continuity and editing were addressed in the second series. So I think, you know, the second series is a much tighter, much more structured, much more chronological, if you like, in one sense. But I don't think it lacks the sort of integrity that the first series had because of that. I think there are, even the Josh Madger situation for one, I think was, you know, that was well recorded and it was quite painful. It was you know, it's not, for Sunderland fans, it's not great viewing, but, you know, for football fans watching something like that, to watch the dynamics of a transfer were actually quite fascinating. And I think the other thing that people have to remember is that both series weren't made for Sunderland fans. They were made for football fans and beyond, and for football fans predominantly outside of England. I mean, the market for Netflix is America. The series are both tailored, thus the subtitles and some of the sort of, you could argue, laboured descriptions of what's happening. It's because the market for Netflix is America. That's where they want these series to make a hit, to make an impression. So I think sometimes you have to step back and say, well, why is this being made? What's the audience? And we all think it's been made for us, as because we're Sunderland, but it's not. It's been made for everybody outside of Sunderland. We just happen to be in the middle of it. So I think you have to look at it in that context and with that perspective as well. And so in terms of judging whether Series 1 or Series 2 was the best series, I think they're very different. And I think they're being made in sort of very different ways. And I think they're both good. I mean, I enjoyed both actually, and I felt that the last two episodes of the second series were exceptional. I think the emotions running through the Wembley.
It was a lot to fit in as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was quite remarkable. So yeah, a hard watch for a lot of Sunderland fans, but I think it was well done, and you can't change history. I think you can't change the story. That's what happened, and I think it was very well documented in the Will Grigg saga. It was fascinating.
Nick, thank you so much for coming on. I hope you're staying safe during this lockdown, and we hope to see you pick up your commentating microphone very soon. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.